Welcome everybody, tnredstar, back with some updates on the Venezuela story. So, as that story further developed, Maduro and his wife were abducted by the United States, particularly Delta Force. Now, we will talk a little bit more about Delta Force and where they come from later on in this video, because there's some irony here when it comes to Delta Force being the ones who were deployed to go and abduct Maduro, who is being accused of being a narco trafficker. And we'll get into all that later. The Vice President, Delcy Rodriguez, has taken over, and she made an official statement condemning the U.S. aggression against Venezuela and demanding the release of Nicolas Maduro. U.S. forces did sustain injuries, and there was some damaged equipment, but there were no casualties on the U.S. side. That is important to clarify, because civilians were killed and civilian infrastructure was damaged in the attacks. Venezuelan soldiers were also killed in these strikes. So people died on the Venezuelan side, including civilians, from these strikes. So these strikes weren't for show whatsoever. These strikes obviously destroyed, but they also killed. Official casualty counts are in the 40s. Venezuelans have flooded the streets in response to the attacks and the abduction of Maduro.
Y aquí desde las calles de Caracas exigimos que nos devuelvan a nuestro presidente Nicolás Maduro, repudiando los hechos nefastos de agresión, de odio por parte del imperio norteamericano hacia el pueblo venezolano.
Multiple organizations from the DSA to PSL and foreign leaders in Russia to China have demanded the immediate release of Maduro and his wife, alongside Vice President Delcy Rodriguez. Now, I do have comments on these mass protests because I feel like they have their place, but it's easy for people to limit themselves to just doing that. More on that later. Venezuelan governors also reaffirmed their loyalty to Maduro and reaffirmed their control of their respective regions of Venezuela. Local militias loyal to Maduro have also vowed to defend Venezuelan sovereignty.
Aquí nos encontramos nuevamente en nuestra parroquia combativa 23 de enero, representando el legado de nuestro comandante Hugo Chávez, defendiendo nuestra parroquia y apoyando a nuestro comandante en jefe Nicolás Maduro Moro, y apoyando junto a la fuerza colectiva 23 de enero y dando lo mejor de todos nosotros del Frente Nacional de Colectivo Sergio Rodríguez en apoyo a Nicolás, nuestro gallo pinto. Que viva Chávez, que viva Nicolás y que viva Venezuela. Que viva.
Trump has openly declared that the U.S. aims to indefinitely occupy Venezuela, along with Cuba, Colombia, and Mexico in the crosshairs for future escalation. And good luck with that, by the way. Now that the newer developments of the story are summarized, I do want to dive in a little bit further into some things. So first things first, I do want to talk about the mass protests led by organizations such as DSA and PSL. These rallies have their place and they're useful. I don't believe they're completely worthless and a complete waste of time and energy. They have their place and they're worth doing, but I feel like it's easy for Americans to limit themselves to this action. And this is in Blood My Eye by George Jackson. There's a quote in the text about how after the mass protest, those people who were at the protests, all of those people who were at the protests, after they leave, they just become regular Americans again. And what does he mean by that? Well, after leaving the protests, you go back to the normal cycle of working and consuming. And that's it. Just working and consuming. All that happened at the protest was folks gave some speeches, marched around with some signs, marched down the street. Yeah, good for optics, good for a spectacle, but it didn't make carrying out further operations in Venezuela any harder. It didn't exact any material consequences for the imperialist action on our tax dime. So I say that to say, we Americans definitely have a duty to get active, to get off our asses and get active. But that doesn't mean simply just going to protests and marching around with signs and canvassing for politicians and voting the perfect candidate in the next election, or voting for the right candidates in the next election. This is something that requires community organizing, community power, grassroots community power to confront. This is something that literally requires you to get to know your neighbor and start organizing with people in your immediate area. And that means organizing with people who aren't necessarily exactly where you are ideologically. I don't mean organizing with your ideological enemies, or like organizing with a fascist, organizing with someone who's like openly racist. And I feel like these mass protests can sometimes inadvertently do more harm than good if all that's happening at these protests are signs being waved around, people marching and giving some nice speeches, but no one has an organization to join, or after the fact. No one has an organization to get plugged into and get involved with after the fact. No one has any further action or work to get involved with outside of that. All that happens is this turns all of this revolutionary rage and revolutionary energy. It almost serves as a pressure valve for all that revolutionary energy. I don't say that to hate on the mass protests and the mass rallies in response to this. I highly encourage that. I strongly believe that's a good response to this. That's a good first response to imperialist aggression. It's the people flooding the streets saying, no, we don't approve this. We, the people, do not approve of this imperialist war, especially while we can barely afford rent at home, or we can barely afford groceries at home, or we can't even afford to buy a house. We can't even retire. You got people as of this year, just as of the first of this month, on New Year's Day, whose insurance premiums are going to skyrocket. People are going to lose health care in this country. So yes, flooding the streets in response to an imperialist aggression is a good first step. But all of that means nothing if that's where it ends. That shouldn't be where it ends. So that's why I'm driving it home. If you're out there as an organization, or if you're an organization putting these together, you have to recruit those people who are out there. There's this other thing, the Four Winds approach to revolution, which is a building dual power, is essentially what it is. You can go out there at these actions, you can go out there and connect with like-minded people to do something like that. And I will be reading the Four Winds approach on this channel. I'm like halfway through it. Got some other texts that I'm editing the audio for, so I just haven't had the time to do a straight through of that the way I wanted to. But nonetheless, we can't let all of this revolutionary energy in response to imperialist aggression start and end at a mass protest. Because one of the biggest mistakes of 2020 was that's what happened. It started at a mass protest and basically ended at a mass protest. But honestly, it ended at the election, because all of that revolutionary energy got co-opted and absorbed by the Democratic Party so they could win in 2020. This is another election year. The worst, gravest mistake that can be made, especially now, is that we repeat the mistake of 2020. And instead of funneling all of this revolutionary energy into organizations that these people can get involved in, building dual power, it will get co-opted by the Democratic Party, who will use this to get votes in the election. And I believe that's something that'll happen regardless, that the Democrats will use, like Venezuela, to get votes in the election. It'll likely, you'll know them when you hear them. They'll be those Democrats who say, oh yeah, Maduro's a bad guy, but Maduro's a dictator, but it's the obligatory condemnation. It's the obligatory irrelevant condemnation of a victim of imperialism. It's just like the condemnation of Hamas, when everyone under the sun was demanding that you condemn Hamas, even if you were highlighting the fact that 3-month-old baby was shot directly in the head, and you have photo and video evidence of that happening deliberately. Do you condemn Hamas? Would be like an obligatory question. Or Hamas are bad guys, but it's the same thing. And it helps no one. It helps no one but the aggressor. It helps no one but the oppressor. It helped condemning these obligatory condemnations of Hamas help no one but Israel. These obligatory condemnations of Maduro and obligatory denunciations of him as a dictator help no one but the U.S. ruling class, the Epstein class. And look, while we're on the subject of Maduro, U.S. Venezuela history, it goes back to the 1800s. Leadership in Venezuela looked a little different back. You see, relations between the U.S. and Venezuela when Venezuela had right-wing leadership. So, something to know. Between 1953 and 1958, Venezuela had a dictator, Marcos Perez Jimenez. He overthrew a democratically elected president, Emilio Gallegos, and seized power in 1948. So he allowed foreign investment from American oil companies and ultimately received the Legion of Merit from the United States government in 1954. Now, this guy was an anti-communist right wing. This guy was a fascist. He was a fascist dictator. But up until 1999, relations between the United States and Venezuela were good. And you want to know why? Because the United States oil companies, American oil companies, had access to the resources in Venezuela, and they could profit off of those resources. But it wasn't until 1999 when that changed. When Hugo Chavez came to power, nationalized the resources for Venezuela, for the people of Venezuela. American oil companies hated that. They fucking hated that. The U.S. ruling class hated that. So what did they try to do? They attempted a coup. In 2002, they abducted Hugo Chavez. But the people of Venezuela flooded the streets, demanding his release. And 2 days later, they let him go. In 2020, there was another failed coup attempt. Now, these are just the major moments with confirmed U.S. involvement. 2020, there was another U.S. coup attempt led by a former Green Beret. They've abducted Maduro, and they're talking about indefinitely occupying the land in Venezuela and controlling the resources. Literal imperialism. They've wanted to do this 27 years. They've been wanting to do this. For 27 years, they've been wanting to overthrow the Bolivarian government, which is still in power, by the way. The Bolivarian government is still in power. But nonetheless, the Bolivarian government's still in power. So while they got Maduro, they still haven't been able to accomplish this 27-year goal that they've had of bringing the Bolivarian revolution to an end. And that's what this is all about. They're saying, and one thing I can say about Trump, just like Lindsey Graham, they say the quiet part out loud. Those are two people you can always count on saying the quiet part out loud. Because at first, the narrative was that this was to stop narco-terrorism, which is bogus, of course, because the DEA's own intel literally shows that Venezuela accounts for such a small, insignificant portion of fentanyl and drug flow. And it doesn't even come from Venezuela. It comes from Colombia and goes through Venezuela out of the Caribbean, but it's not U.S. bound. It's not even U.S. bound. The fentanyl that comes into America comes into America from Americans, smuggled in by Americans from the southern border. That's done by American citizens. But even before that narrative, which that narrative didn't take long to fall apart at all, because, come on, just some basic Google searching can tear that narrative apart, almost instantly. They switched to the narrative that this is to control Russian and Chinese influence, which is partially true, that this is to contain Russian and Chinese influence in the area. And they claim that there's they're that they're Hezbollah ties and Hamas ties. Now they're getting hysterical, like completely hysterical. Nonetheless, they keep changing the narrative. But Trump finally said they're gonna get our oil back. Now, when Trump says our oil back, he doesn't mean U.S. American citizen oil back. That's Venezuela's oil for first and foremost, but he's meaning corporations oil that they used to be able to profit off of until Hugo Chavez came into power. That's what he means. And that's what this is about. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, and they've controlled those resources for 27 years. Think about that. For 27 years. Now, yeah, we can talk a lot about this. Is just more of a reason for nations like Cuba, even Venezuela, to have nuclear weapons. You don't see this happening in North Korea. You don't see them flying into Pyongyang and then perp walking Kim Jong-un in New York City. And you don't see that for a reason. There's a reason why North Korea has nuclear weapons. There's a reason why Iran wants to get nuclear weapons. And they have every right to get, because when you're constantly threatened by imperialist expansion, whether it's Zionist expansion or corporate American expansion, these people, you're dealing with people who can't be trusted in peace negotiations, people who will kill a diplomat during peace negotiations, people who will kill civilians in order to fulfill some kind of theocratic prophecy or for profit. And when you know you can't fight a conventional war, especially for a real long time, your best bet is to get nuclear weapons for a deterrent. You can be mad at me for saying that all you want, but I'm not the guy invading a sovereign country in the middle of the night. That's Trump and company, which includes Democrats and anyone else who's manufactured consent for this escalation. So if you oppose nuclear proliferation, you should oppose an invasion of Venezuela. No matter how you feel about Maduro, because I'm going to be honest, this is honestly the last thing I'm going to say before I end this episode off. Your opinion as an American citizen of Nicolas Maduro and the Bolivarian Revolution is utterly irrelevant. Let's just get that out the way. It's utterly irrelevant. Especially if you want to call this man a dictator. You want to call this man a dictator when he allows people to spread propaganda about his country from within the borders of Venezuela. He's not as hard on free speech as people think he is, or as he should be, if we're being honest. This is the product of not being as hard as you should on this is the product of that right here. Because when you live in a nation that's under constant sanction, that's under constant threat, whether it's sanctions, because remember, sanctions kill. Sanctions aren't just some symbolic sanctions aren't just some symbolic measure done to show condemnation or disapproval. No, sanctions literally are meant to destroy the economy of a state, of a state, to the point where the idea is to make conditions so insufferable for the general population of that state to where they would want to overthrow that government and power. It brings all the suffering onto the people. So you've got the people of Venezuela suffering because of unbelievable sanctions by the U.S. and the West. Constant threat of coup or invasion, well within his rights to clamp down on some of the speech in Venezuela. You can't talk like that in China, about China. You can't go and spread false information about China from within China's borders. You can't go spreading CIA propaganda about China from within China's borders. There's a reason why you don't see Black Hawk helicopters and Chinooks flying through Beijing, and you don't see them perp walking Xi Jinping. But also, this is the same country that, for one, the primary contradiction here in this country is that it's a settler colonial country founded on genocide and land erasure and built on slavery, and you could even say genocide. You could even say built on genocide, and none of that's really changed. The United States has never opposed genocide or crimes against humanity. It's literally what this country was founded on. It's the primary contradiction of this country. We've also got masked agents rolling around different cities and small towns, throwing people in unmarked vehicles and taking them off to who knows where sometimes. Taking them off to ICE detention centers where some of them are being found with their hands and with their wrists and ankles tied, and they're hung. Pregnant women having miscarriages in ICE custody. But yeah, we want to call Maduro a dictator. We want to call Maduro a dictator, but a Black Hawk helicopter was used to repel ICE agents right onto an apartment complex in Chicago where they literally zip-tied children, where they literally said, fuck them kids, as they had children zip-tied at 3 o'clock in the morning. But sure, call Venezuela a dictatorship. Call Maduro a dictator. Call Maduro a dictator. While you benefit, while your taxes, our taxes, fund the bombs that have flattened Gaza, while you see students lose scholarships over speaking out against it, expelled from school entirely for speaking out against it, targeted by the state even for speaking out against it. But sure, Maduro is a dictator. The point I'm making is, if you're a U.S. American and you feel the need for some reason to condemn President Maduro, to call him a dictator, to try to speak for Venezuelans and say that they support this, to use the singular Venezuelan that you know who lives over here, to use their voice and what they tell you as a reason to support this. That's all the updates I've got for today. Those are also my thoughts on this. Again, you hit the streets in these mass protests, that's good. Definitely take part in these mass protests, but do not let your action end at these mass protests. Get involved with the organizations that are out there. Find whatever else you can get plugged into and get involved there. Start building dual power. There's a whole plan available on the internet. I will have it linked in the description down below. I'll even be posting a reading of it on this channel here shortly, where you can start implementing a literal plan to start building dual power by simply talking to your neighbors. For example, you could host a little neighborhood get-together, neighborhood potluck, have an honest conversation about the state of the world, state of the country, what everyone's material problems are, and what solutions everyone may have. Brainstorm ideas. Form a neighborhood committee. We got time for electoralism. We got money to donate to these political campaigns. You can put some energy into building some dual power with your neighbors and starting a neighborhood committee, something that small, a neighborhood committee. And those meetings don't have to be any longer than an hour. That's like the length of a Netflix series episode. If you can watch a Netflix series, there's really not a reason you can't sit through an hour-long meeting with the neighborhood committee or with fellow organizers. The path is up to you. You choose your path. It's up to you. Build dual power with your neighbors. Get involved with an organization. Plenty of other good socialist organizations out there. I'll do another video on that. I got to do some more research on them because I'm not personally familiar with every single one, but I know I've met some comrades and different socialist groups in the country that are good people, good and principled people. That's a video coming another day, but nonetheless, get involved with an organization and start building dual power. Do both. because that's what it's going to take. A better world is possible, but that better world has to be struggled for and it has to be taken. We're not going to be able to ask for it. We're not going to be able to vote for it. We got to take it. We got to take what's ours. Until next time, y'all. Deuces.